Welcome to another episode of The Corner Booth, the official podcast of restaurantowner.com. Today, the restaurant industry is changing faster than ever. Learn from successful independent restaurant operators and other industry leaders as they share best practices that will help you engage your team, delight your guests, and grow your business.
And welcome everyone to another episode of Corner Booth. I'm Chris Tripoli with restaurantowner.com. Restaurantowner.com proudly brings you Corner Booth, where we present episodes of conversations, candid conversations with today's restaurant entrepreneurs. Restaurantowner.com is recognized as the single greatest source of information and education on the web today that is directed at you independent restaurant owner operators. So whether you're starting up, whether you're operating now, whether you are looking to improve performance or perhaps ready to grow, check out restaurantowner.com. Today, I'm bringing you some tremendous success conversations on the concept development process, the way to master management of multiple concepts and plan growth, because I have with us today from Los Angeles, the founder of the Pagani Hospitality Group, managing partner of Mother Wolf Group, Giancarlo Pagani. Giancarlo, thank you so much for taking some time. Welcome to Corner Booth.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, listen, you've got a multitude of concepts. Most of our listeners may have heard of more than one or followed them or been in one. But before we jump into that, I would always like to have our initial minutes taken on you exposing yourself and your connection to hospitality. How did you know it was for you? How did you decide to get into the biz? Maybe you could share with us some of your unique early influences.
Sure. My story is probably not a typical story, but I grew up with a father who was a restaurateur and ran probably one of the most notorious dining rooms in Los Angeles, which was the dining room at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. And he ran that dining room in the 80s and early 90s. And, I was born kind of midway through that period, but I spent my early years at that restaurant. And that was so I guess my upbringing was around people that worked in restaurants. My dad's friends were people that worked with him. They were managers, they were bartenders, they were busboys, kind of all of it. So after school, when I wanted to see my dad, I'd go to the restaurant and I'd help polish glassware. And that was my earliest experience. And then in the late 90s, my father and my mother opened a restaurant in West Hollywood called Pagani Restaurant. And that was actually my first exposure to the opening of a restaurant and kind of all the things that went into it. And so, although I wasn't directly involved in the opening of the restaurant, I witnessed it. And I witnessed what my parents went through to get that place open and dealing with investors and promoting the restaurant and launching the restaurant and the highs and the lows and all interesting stuff. But it brought really incredible memories for me. And that was kind of like up until 2000. Unfortunately, my father's restaurant went under. And so that was also the first time I got to see a bankruptcy in a restaurant, which was, obviously that's a really interesting process to go through and to witness. But then my family moved to Vegas after that. And when I was 16, I needed to get a job, and Michael Mina was opening up a restaurant at MGM Grand called Sea Blue. And I was in high school, and my dad was working for Michael running his flagship restaurant, the Bellagio. And my dad said, hey, they're going to be a great place for you to start as a busboy there or a busser. Sure. And I said, okay. I didn't really have a choice. My dad's like, you got to go to work. So I didn't have much of a choice. But I was 16, 17, and I was brought into a very professional fine dining environment where things were very structured. I had to go to training wearing slacks and, very, very well polished shoes, and my shirt had to be crisp. And it was the first time in my life where I started to kind of learn those standards. And we opened the restaurant, and it was the hardest thing I ever did. It was, being a busser in a high volume fine dining restaurant is extremely challenging. From the time you get there, for your 8 or 9 or 10 hours that you're there, you are working nonstop. And I was going to school full time, so it was really challenging. I get out of work at midnight some nights or 1 a.m. some nights, and I had to be at school at 7, 8 a.m. And it was difficult, and especially being 17, 16, 17. I remember leaving a Saturday night, and it was, I don't know if it was a concert or there was something that happened at the hotel, but it was the busiest the restaurant had ever been. And I remember just getting rocked at that restaurant. And I remember calling my dad at the end of the night saying, "Dad, I don't know if this is for me. This is too hard." And he literally just said, "Hey, talk to me when you've been working for 45, 50 years, and then you can complain to me." And I literally said, "You know what? You're right." And I went back to work the next day. But so I had that was my experience. But the biggest takeaway I got from working in that restaurant at a young age is I had a really incredible general manager,
Mm-hmm.
and his name was Patrick Humel. And he'd be my first mentor. He was, I think Patrick at the time was like in his late 20s. He was a very well put together, good looking, very charismatic guy, very service driven, very hardworking, but very fun. And growing up in the business, a lot of the people that were in those positions were rigid and, kind of had this do as I say mentality. And
Right.
and Patrick just brought this incredible life to the hard work. And he's the one that pushed me to be really good at it, because if I he was on my back every night there to push me. And it was like a coach in a sense. And it really, then the hard work became rewarding because I liked the recognition I was getting for being good at the thing,
Yeah, I can
you
see
know,
how that. Yes, of
and
course.
that was like from there. There's eventually I got the chance to open up restaurants with Patrick and with Michael Mina throughout the country. I traveled to Detroit. We traveled to Scottsdale. We did Miami, and I got to help train busters and runners, and that was my role in those openings. But I really gravitated towards it because I got recognition for it, and I think that.
That's really an interesting point that I just kind of want to stress, especially for your listeners who are in management positions. Think about the impact that you're making if you recognize that hardworking employee who's a busser or a line cook, could be the prep guy, he's 16, 17. But if you see that a little bit of interest in that person and you do provide information, motivation, a little push, just think of the fact that you might be hearing years later that they appreciated that they got the recognition. That recognition burned the fire a little bit greater and boop, and pushed them forward. I had a general manager like that in my teen years. And I still remember Ray Nardoni. And I just think it's fantastic that you can remember the early mentor and what type of impact he obviously built, in your character.
Yeah, and because I was hardworking and I was obviously good at what I do, but I was good at what I did because he taught me how to do it and he pushed me to get better at it. And he gave me opportunities, and I took advantage of those opportunities because I started to enjoy it, because I started to enjoy the potential growth in it. And
Yeah.
it can be an incredibly fun environment, especially if you're passionate about it. But I think to echo what you're saying, is that now I look for those younger individuals who, maybe don't have an education, maybe
Mhm.
this is their first job, maybe they're not sure if they want to go to college or go for more of a traditional route, but they're unsure if this is the kind of the path for them. And I think it can be if they have the right mentors and leadership that's showing them what this can be. And from that point forward, I kind of just continued. By the time I was 21, I was a manager at a restaurant with Michael Mina and a company called SBE here in LA. And it was that restaurant up on Sunset and Crescent Heights called 14 was the first time I went from coming from a very formal restaurant background to their new partnership with SBE, who was lifestyle. And I just gravitated towards the lifestyle and the nightlife kind of component of the lifestyle, which,
Sure.
growing up through restaurants, I never really hung out with the restaurant people outside of the restaurants. I always liked hanging out with the nightlife people because they're more fun, and
Yeah.
nightclubs are fun.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of a layer of separation. I wasn't going out and doing things with restaurant people as much. But at some point I transitioned through that restaurant over from the Michael Mina side to the SBE side because I just really gravitated towards their style of restaurants, which were they had fine dining foundations, but they were fun restaurants. They were what you'd call like trendy restaurants in the early 2000s, but they were driven off of really great quality food and beverage with
And
consistent
what were some of
service.
the examples of the restaurants in the SBE group that
Well,
were?
the most notorious one was the Bazaar by Jose Andres,
Yes.
which opened at the SLS, and it was the first restaurant in probably 10, 12 years that received, I think, 4 stars by the LA Times by Irene Verbela. So not only was it a fun and beautiful and energetic restaurant, but it was also high quality. And then other restaurants that were in the portfolio that were really fun was Katsuya, which is probably one of the most successful sushi concepts to come out of LA. And that was built on incredible sushi from Katsuya Uechi, a great cocktail program by a guy named Ryan McGarrian, who I don't know if he's around anymore. And it was vibrant and there was celebrities going there. And so I just liked that style of restaurant because it was a little less uptight, and that actually led me to my next mentor, which was a guy named Matt Erickson, who at the time was the director of operations for SBE Restaurant Group. And he like Patrick, he had worked his way up through the ranks and he was kind of a coach. He grew up playing sports, so he had that coach mentality, but he saw how I was coming from Michael Mina, which was I was a bit rigid. I always had my hands like my arms closed. And he would be the one to constantly have to tell me, like, hey, smile, relax. This is supposed to be fun. So it was a little less serious. And I certainly gravitated. And I'd say I'm probably somewhere in between both nowadays. But, from there, I just grew through the ranks. Like once I really was dead set on this is what I was going to do. And it took me a little time to really commit to it. I'd say by my early 20s, I was really fully into it. But I just started going the ranks. So I went from, when I was a manager, I couldn't wait to be an assistant general manager. I worked really
Right.
hard to get the promotion. And then when I was an AGM, I said, I can't wait. I'm going to be a GM. And I did that kind of quickly. And it's interesting because working in a corporate environment, I always thought that if you were the director of operations, you were totally made. You must be printing cash. You want a lifestyle. And then I'd get that job and realize oh, it's actually just a little bit better. And
Right. I still have a ways to go.
yeah. And then I did that up until, when I was 28 years old, Sam Nazarian offered, he was acquiring Morgan's Hotel Group on the East Coast. And I was 28 years old. I was living in Miami, overseeing the properties there. And he offered me to be the vice president of food and beverage for the entire East Coast. 28. Okay. And I was, obviously that was the pinnacle for me. It's I did it, I found it. But then I started thinking to myself, man, this is all great. And looking at the comp package for that was, it's a great comp package. Don't get me
Well, of
wrong.
course it is. Yes.
But I told myself, I was like, Sam, I'm never going to be you Sam Nazarian, I'm never going to be you if I keep working for you. And so a week after I had signed the offer letter, I called Sam. He was in Miami, and I said, "Hey, listen, I love you, man. The past 8 years have been amazing, but I'm gonna resign." And he's like, "Well, what are you gonna do?" I'm like, "I'm gonna figure it out on my own." And that started the next part of my journey, which is the entrepreneurial side of it, which is
There you go.
way more challenging.
28. At 28, you stepped out and decided, I'm going to figure it out on my own. I'm going to be an entrepreneur. I'm going to develop my own concepts.
Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, you've had a very successful run at it. But that to me isn't just because you've had a successful number of restaurants, and I'd love to have you describe the concepts as we go. But I think what you seem to be most unique in doing is not just being able to concept and open multiple restaurants and, thank heavens, multiple successful restaurants. But these restaurants seem to be accessible to a wide variety of people. I mean, in LA, for example, you'll have restaurants that I know could attract the, say, everyday worker in the area, a visitor for business, a tourist, an A-list celeb. Okay, not everyone gets that wide variance. There's something about the way you see concepts that create an experience where that whole circle is accessible. And I'd love to have you spend some time and explain to the listeners the approach you take to creating a concept experience.
Sure. I think one of the things that we looked at, and we'll use Mother as an example, because this is the most successful project I've been in part of, is, we weren't trying to be like a dark and moody and trendy restaurant.
Okay.
And I think a lot of times when you're designing restaurants, you think in order for me to get this cool clientele, that's going to make this a place to be, it has to feed kind of vibey and, and moody and dark. And there are some restaurants that have success that way. And if you look at the past 20 years of restaurants in LA, most of those restaurants don't exist anymore. And I think ultimately, we wanted to build a restaurant first and foremost that was warm and inviting that anybody could appreciate. And I think a great reference is, look at Balthazar in New York.
Sure.
It's a very warm, it's an inviting restaurant, and it's open all day, and it captures a very wide audience. But the who's who of New York City go there, celebrities go there, your average tourist goes there, your worker in the neighborhood goes there. And I think that was a good benchmark for us and a reference for us that we used when we built Mother Wolf, because so I think you can try to build restaurants that are going to capture that kind of celebrity. I think that also comes with who's attached to the project more so in the beginning than just the restaurant you're designing. But at
Yeah.
the end of the day, I think you just want to have a place that feels very warm and inviting, that you would say a family could dine here, you could come on a date here, you could have a business meeting here, and you can kind of capture all of that. And so I think when you look at Mother Wolf as that example, like it's very warm. It's very inviting. We never make it too dark. We don't try to be moody and sexy. It's actually a little bit bright for the way even I like to dine at restaurants sometimes. But it seems to
Okay.
be what works because, I bring my son who's 3 years old here and he doesn't feel out of place. And I think when we're looking at restaurants, I think the most important thing I've learned over the past several years is your concept has to be very tight. It can't be ambiguous in any way. You have to be able to look at an outsider has to be able to look at your website or read about your restaurant and know exactly what they're getting into, right? And then when they get to the restaurant, you have to hit on service, you have to hit on the design, you have to hit on the music, you have to hit on the lighting. The food has to be very consistent, but you have to not only have a concept that's very clearly defined, but I think you also have to hit all the points these days. I think back in the day, 10 years ago, you can
Sure.
get away with portions of that, parts of it. Maybe the food's good, but the vibe's not good. Maybe the
Mhm.
design's cool, but the food's not great. I think service, no matter what, always has to be consistent and it has to be attentive and it has to be warm, but it doesn't need to be overbearing. But I think nowadays, as you're designing a restaurant, like you can't really sacrifice any one of those elements. I think you really, to be successful and to have longevity, you have to focus on all of them.
Well put.
I think there's a lot of people, and I also think that like when you look at like the track record of restaurants that close, they you can typically look back at it and say there was a few elements missed, and unfortunately in our business, I think everybody loves the fantasy of owning and operating a restaurant. But if you don't come from
Yes.
this world, it's very challenging, and
Absolutely.
the work it takes to operate these businesses is very different than if you're not from this industry. Unlike me, I've grown up in this industry. I don't know it any other way. So I'm used to the long days. It's just how I was raised. So to me, it's just a no brainer. It's kind of second nature for me. But I think people also underestimate what it takes to be successful, and just to even not even be successful, just to even keep the doors open.
Well, I think you hit a very good point. And yeah, I think a lot of our listeners would agree. For some reason, I've been in this industry, well, like yourself, all my life. I don't think I have a really good answer for this one, but for some reason, people in other industries, quite frankly, who have been successful in other industries, seem that they can't wait to get to a point where they take early retirement, grab a bunch of money, and open up their restaurant because they
Right.
always wanted to be in the restaurant business or they always wanted to have a bar like the one that they had when they went to college. And I thought, you've been selling, whatever, oil equipment for 40 years. You've made a tremendous living and you're going to dump tons of money that you saved into a restaurant not coming from this industry. Yeah, I know, but I'll make it work. So yes, it's very difficult to understand, but a lot of people do. But if everyone will remember how you just said so smoothly and so quickly, the best way to follow is to have an objective of longevity. And that's true. If the restaurants are going to last a long time, it's because, as you said, their success is consistent. Their balance is the total of everything. They create an
Mhm.
experience because the design and the music and the food and the service created that comfort zone. We see too many times where somebody has maybe a really good chef and food that is written up and beautiful on the plate, and 3 years later they close, and we can't understand because we love the food.
Yeah.
And it was because the other things didn't click.
Yeah, well, you also have to have the operational experience to understand how to make a restaurant profitable because you have to understand how to flex your expenses when sales are down, and you have to understand how to save when they're up. I think the other thing too is, and I'm guilty of this, and I closed a restaurant a year ago. You have to be careful not to force deals through. And what I mean is that a lot of times people have an idea and they find a space, and the space, maybe it's a good rent, maybe it's checks some of the boxes, but maybe it's not the perfect layout for them. Maybe there's some elements to it that feel very forced, and you end up moving forward with the deal because you just want to get it done. And those restaurants tend not to do well. And I fell into that as well. We had an idea of a concept, we found a space, and what it ended up opening as was different than what we intended to do from the get go. And to be honest, it was great fanfare. The food was fantastic. It was chef driven. It was a beautiful restaurant, but it's not what we set out to do. And ultimately, it didn't have all of the elements to it, and it didn't tie together, and it wasn't very clear as to what the place represented. And I think that was a big miss for us. And, on one hand, it's a shame to have closed the restaurant. It was a great learning experience for me.
Good point. Sometimes we find ourselves in that situation where it's a tough decision, but the best foot forward is one back. And so if we had to step back, lick your wounds, learn from the mistakes. But again, what came out of that is another wonderful point that I hope everyone made a note of. And that is success really isn't forced. You can't, because you have a good concept, think that this site that is maybe a C or a B site, it'll work anyway. Or if you really have the needs to do a concept and it costs X, but you don't have X, you have Y, but that's okay. We're going to make it happen anyway. And I've seen people trip over that too. So I'm really getting some really good reminders
Yeah.
from your story here. And that is all the pieces of the puzzle seem that they're going to have to fit. It's got to be the right concept at the right place, at the right time, with maybe the right team and the right amount of money. Because if one of those pieces of the puzzle don't fit, then it sounds like what I'm hearing from you is we're setting ourselves up for trouble.
Yeah. I mean, underfinancing is a huge reason why restaurants close. I think a lot of restaurant investors, are hopeful that the restaurant's going to be a success out the gate. But if it's not, and they're not prepared, if your investors aren't prepared to write another check if they have to, then you have to be very careful about who your investors are. You want to have people that understand what they're getting into, understand the risk involved, and understand that, well, first of all, you should have working capital in your opening budget to begin with. And
Good.
if you don't, you need to have investors that you can call on if you need to. But that's a huge reason people close early is under finance.
And are you finding even with your experience now and your multiple concept success and Mother Wolf off to the races, LA and other cities, are you finding that it's still difficult?
Yeah,
The costs are stupidly crazy high. That's all I'm hearing is that in order to start a restaurant today, occupancy costs for good locations are off the charts. I don't know where landlords are getting their rationale. But then if you find the right spot, then the amount of money to raise to design, build, open, equip is like twice what just a few years ago people thought it would be. Is that what you're finding?
yeah, sure. I mean, it's certainly more expensive. I think also the restaurant business is different now because if you look at restaurateurs like Keith McNally and Baltazar, who opened probably 30 years ago. You look at guys like Mr. Chow, who've been operating for 50, 60 years. When they opened restaurants, they didn't need a lot of investors.
No.
And so you could own one upscale kind of large format restaurant, like 120, 150 seats, and you can become wealthy off that one restaurant because you might have one investor that put in, $500,000 and you own the majority and you can live off that. Nowadays, if you're doing big restaurants, you have to raise a lot of capital to those restaurants, which means at the end of the day, like, you're not getting wealthy off owning a restaurant. And it is stressful and it is high risk. And so I think it's incredible to do these big brands if you have the resources and the means to put those deals together. But I also think, like, if you've got a concept and you can figure out how to find a second or third generation space and it's not a big investment and you can retain the majority of ownership in that, you can live off of one restaurant pretty successfully. And I think, it just depends on what your goals are. But certainly, the large format restaurants that are sexy and you think you know they must make a ton of profit. Even so, they make a ton of profit. You have so many investors in there that you're working for your investors in a lot of ways. And so I think it's just to understand that side of the business, and that way it can help you make decisions based off like realities as opposed to like dreams.
And I think, that explanation right there also burst the bubble that maybe needs to be burst for a lot of startups that feel like these successful restaurant owners obviously own the whole restaurant or they own a tremendous amount of the restaurant, only to maybe later find that, wait a second, in order to do the restaurant, a lot of successful operators have a structure like you were just describing. They're probably charging a fee to run it. And then they do own some, but some, because they may have had to give a majority of it away in order to raise the money to
Hmm.
open the restaurant. I don't think that's what the outsider, thinks when they're moving into our industry and they're going to open up a store.
That's why my recommendation to people is find a space that requires less capital, so that your raise is smaller, and and try to retain as much ownership as you can. As I do deals in the future, that's how I look at everything now.
Sure. Well, let's spend a little more time on Mother Wolf, if you wouldn't mind. The concept, when did it open in LA? I know it's expanded. For some of our listeners, maybe tell a little bit about it, the restaurant, its operation, size, design, menu, etc.
Yeah, sure. So we opened on New Year's Eve going into 2022. So now we're starting our fifth year of operations. Mother Wolf is 10,000 square foot restaurant, about 250 seats. And what else? It's a difficult restaurant to get into. And I think, one of the things that we did when we opened Mother Wolf is we opened in an area that wasn't high-end destination. We
Right.
opened we opened in Hollywood, which isn't necessarily a restaurant destination. However, we acquired a beautiful historic building called the Citizen newspaper, the Citizen News building, which was which housed the Citizen newspaper in the 1930s, and got a beautiful history. And so, what's interesting is that even though we're in Hollywood, you really feel like you're transported when you come here. It's a beautiful Art Deco building,
Absolutely.
and we wanted to build a restaurant that really felt transportive and wasn't like anything else that had been built in Los Angeles in probably decades. And it's a large restaurant. 10,000 square feet is a very large restaurant. And so we wanted the place to feel like, a very upscale brasserie and have all those elements of a brasserie with the antique mirrors and the beautiful chandeliers. And I think we certainly accomplished that.
Yes, it is. It's beautiful, and I'm glad you brought up where it's located because the transformation of an old historic building is something that, again, not everyone gets to have an opportunity to do. You did. You did a wonderful job of it. It's epic. Everybody needs to check that out. Because of its size now, it seems to be wonderful for a wide variety of uses, whether it's business, whether it's date night, whether it's celebrity partying. You've got private dining rooms, beautiful bar, Italian theme menu. I'm just finishing the description for you. I love it.
Well, it's a destination restaurant. And when you build a destination restaurant, it has to feel special. Otherwise, you build a restaurant that's less impressive and you put it in a neighborhood where you've got guaranteed traffic. But if you're going to be a destination where people are going to have to travel to get to your restaurant, you want to make sure when they walk in, they feel like it's spectacular.
So with the success of Mother Wolf, how does that change, say, your position now? What's a day in the life like when you've got multiple concepts, different cities, and your role as the managing partner? What are, how do you see your challenges and how do you get through the day?
Well, my day in big part is making sure that Mother Wolf is operating efficiently, that the reviews are still positive, and that all the elements that made this restaurant special are still operating at a very high level. And so I spend a lot of time on that with the team here, and the rest of the day is spent on kind of new development.
Okay.
And I have kind of two paths. One path is where we develop IP and we develop new concepts like Mother Wolf and some other things that we've got working. And then the other side is that I just found over the past couple of years that, Los Angeles and Southern California in general, there's a narrative to people that aren't from the state that it's difficult to do business here. And it scares away a lot of operators. But Los Angeles is an important city in the US and it's an important food city. So most restaurant groups want to have a presence in LA, but most restaurant groups don't want to go through kind of the loopholes and the headaches of trying to set up a business here and operate a business in California. So a niche that I found was licensing brands and bringing them to California because I ultimately want to expand my operational footprint in Los Angeles because I'm an Angelino at heart and I'm not going anywhere and I plan to be here for the rest of my life and raise my son here. And so I have the drive to continue growing here. But I also think that, as a call it restaurateur, it's difficult to have a lot of successes creating new IP. And the economics of licensing a brand can be very similar to if you were to partner with a chef, if you're a restaurateur, or if you're or vice versa. And so by licensing brands, I've now found this entire new path to grow my infrastructure here in LA and to expand my business. And so I've licensed a few brands now. We're opening Mott 32 towards the end of this year, which is one of the most highly accoladed Chinese restaurants from Hong Kong. And
Great.
It's similar to Mother Wolf in the sense that it's a large footprint, it's upscale, but it's very refined food and very refined service and doesn't really exist in the market here, which is why we're building it. And then I also partnered with a company called Good People Group and a chef named Eyal Shani from Tel Aviv, who's got a ton of different brands that we're bringing to Los Angeles. And one of them is a fun, fast casual Israeli Mediterranean street food concept called Miznon. We've got the first one open in downtown LA at Grand Central Market, and now expanding that brand in Southern California with new location coming up on West 3rd Street, Culver City, Beverly Hills, the Valley. And so we're hoping to grow that business to like a 5 to 10 unit business within the next 2 years. And so it's this new thing where, on one side we like to create IP and like to own the IP and all that, and that's fantastic if you can be successful at it. But it's also, some of the wealthiest families I know in our business are franchisees of, Burger Kings, and they own 100 Burger Kings and Subways, right? And so that franchise business, I think also if it's something that you desire to do, it's a great way to enter into the market because you can acquire the rights to a proven brand. And so you can learn about it in a space that's going to actually generate revenue. And so you're less focused on the marketing component of it because it's already an existing brand. So
Right.
I really like that I really like this part of the business, which is not something I ever considered, 5-10 years ago.
Well, that's true. And it is truly unique for people who are listening to someone who is very successful in concepting from scratch, creating names, brands, and then expanding, on that to create good value. To also be interested, say, in sort of teaming up, license something that you're interested in, but you don't have to create. Like you said, you don't really have to market. It's already known. It's been created. You're going to license and bring it into the market that you like. And that's great. And it is good to hear some positive out of that market because it is pretty common to hear people on this podcast and others talk about the disadvantages of trying to grow their brand and create value in California. We'll hear too much about cost of living's too high, cost of occupancy's too high, governmental taxes are too high, petroleum's too high, yada, yada, yada. Labor's too high. So how am I going to be able to, create a good margin and create some worth? It's very competitive and too expensive. So I love hearing the counter of that because a lot of that is true. I mean, you are playing in a pretty darn expensive neck of the woods, but you seem to
Yeah,
be very
sure.
bullish.
Yeah, but sure. But it's also like this is one of the best times that I've seen in my career to go find spaces and lease spaces. You can negotiate great deals right now. You can get percentage only rents. You can get no rent for a year. You can find a landlord that's going to give you a ton of TI work. There's a lot of that on the table right now. And so it's a good time to be in the position where you are looking to expand your business right now, especially because of what's happened in LA over the past year and everybody's staying away from it. So if you're in a position to open a restaurant, now's a good time to find a space, find the right space. And yeah, I don't know. I'll tell you, I really am enjoying the part of also why I really enjoy the licensing component, because I really enjoy the chance to work with other companies and work with other founders and other leaders in hospitality, and it like really expands your horizon. And it's great. I work with some of the best in the business now. I mean, on one side, I work with Evan Funke, which is so special, and he's such an incredible restaurateur. I get to work with Wes Avila, but now I'm also working with Malcolm, who's the CEO of Maximal Hospitality, who owns Ma 32, and that's an entire new path and a new company I get to learn from them. They've got a ton of international success throughout Asia and other markets, and now they've gone to the Middle East. And then on the other side of that, I have the Good People Group, and I'm learning from Eyal Shani and his partner Shahar Sagal, and they've got a completely different perspective on hospitality. But it's just all really interesting, and honestly, it makes for a really nice day because I have calls with all these different people throughout my days, throughout the weeks, and it really is like. It's exciting. I guess it's probably what like a producer of movies feels like. They're always constantly kind of hustling, but working with different creatives along the way, and it's just interesting and it's fun and exciting.
I would say that yes to all of that. And it's wonderful to hear that coming from somebody who's obviously already obtained some success on the development side and has some tremendous success with a concept that's growing. To underline those things, that it's interesting to team up with others. It seems like we never stop learning.
No, absolutely.
Well, Giancarlo, thank you so much. These pearls of wisdom are really, really helpful. I really enjoyed talking with you. I wish we had a lot more time. May have to have you come back maybe after a couple of these license partnerships have expanded a little bit to have you kind of give us a sequel on life then. But you're doing tremendously well. We wish you best continued success in all of your ventures. Thanks again for your bullish attitude on LA, one of the key, F&B cities that we have in our nation. And so to everyone else, listen, you've been listening to Giancarlo Pagani, Mother Wolf Group. Haven't been, not all of us have. Look it up. Fantastic organization, wonderful restaurant. And I hope that some of these tidbits that we've been sharing work well for you on your path to improve your restaurant operation or get your concept started correctly or grow prudently. This is Corner Booth, product of restaurantowner.com. We hope that you'll go make it a great shift, and let's meet up again soon on another Corner Booth. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on the Corner Booth. We'll be back next Tuesday with more inspiration, insights, and industry best practices to help you engage your team, delight your guests, and grow your business.